morning, everyone. Today, we're going on a deep dive,
Mm.
really exploring the impact of visual clutter. And I want you to think about this as we're talking. Like, have
Yeah.
you ever thought about how what's around you, like your surroundings, might actually be like messing with your brain power?
Yeah.
We're not just talking about like a messy desk.
Right.
It's more about like how the entire visual landscape around us
Mm-hmm.
could be like secretly, sabotaging our ability to think clearly.
Absolutely. It's true. We often just think about clutter as like an aesthetic thing, like, oh, it's just visually not that nice. But research is actually showing that it goes way deeper than that. It affects our cognitive function. Like it's happening on a neurological level.
Okay, so let's break this down a little bit.
Yeah.
What exactly do we mean when we say visual clutter?
Yeah.
And how does it actually like mess with our brains?
So visual clutter is basically anything in our visual field that's like, hey, look at me. It's competing for our attention. And it pulls us away from what we're actually trying to focus on. So think about like a desk that's just covered in papers and stuff. Or a countertop where you can't even see the surface because there's so many appliances and things piled up. Or even a wall that's got too many pictures and decorations.
Yeah.
Every single item, even if you like it, like a little knickknack or something, it becomes a mini distraction.
So it's like our brains are just constantly trying to like process all this extra visual information.
Exactly. And that takes energy. It takes a toll on us. And there was actually a recent study from Yale University. They used fMRI scans to show that visual clutter actually disrupts the way information flows in the visual cortex.
Right.
That's the part of our brain that processes what we see.
Oh, wow. So there's like a real measurable impact on brain activity.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. The researchers actually described it as a neural traffic jam. So instead of information just like flowing smoothly through the visual cortex, it gets all bogged down and slowed by all these competing stimuli.
Oh.
It's like if you imagine a highway during rush hour, way too many cars trying to cram into the same space, and everything just grinds to a halt.
So it's not just a feeling of being overwhelmed, like,
Right.
oh, there's so much stuff. There's actually like a neurological bottleneck happening.
That's exactly it. And this constant effort to filter out all those distractions, it leads to this whole cascade of negative effects on how well our brains work, like our cognitive function. And researchers have actually identified 4 major ways that visual clutter just messes with our thinking.
Okay, I am ready to lay it on me.
Yeah.
What are the 4 horsemen of the cognitive apocalypse?
All right. So first up, we've got impaired focus.
Okay.
Every single item in a cluttered space becomes a potential distraction. Like, ooh, shiny. It's pulling your attention away from what you're trying to concentrate on.
Yeah.
There was a study published in the Journal of Neuroscience, and they found that even a really brief exposure to clutter can really reduce our ability to focus on a task.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
It's like trying to read a book with the TV blaring in the background.
Exactly. And then that leads us to the second impact, which is reduced working memory.
Okay.
And working memory, that's like our brain's little Post-it note.
Yeah.
It's that short-term mental storage that we use to hold information while we're working on something, like trying to remember a phone number while you're dialing it.
Oh my gosh, I struggle with that so much, especially when I'm in a cluttered environment. It's like my brain is already full, just trying to make sense of all the mess around me.
Oh, I totally get it. And you're not alone.
Okay.
Research actually suggests that all that mental effort of filtering out the distractions from clutter, it actually makes our brains tired.
Really?
Yeah, it makes it harder to hold on to information in our working memory. There was a study in the journal Psychological Science, and they found that people actually did worse on memory tasks when they were surrounded by clutter.
So it's not just that I'm like being lazy or disorganized.
Right.
The clutter is actually making it harder for me to remember things.
That's exactly right. And this brings us to number 3, increased distractibility. So the more our brains are exposed to clutter, the worse we get at ignoring distractions in general. It's like our brains are being trained to be distracted by that constant visual noise.
So it's not just that the clutter is distracting in the moment, but it's actually making me more susceptible to distractions in general.
Yes.
Even if I like move to a less cluttered environment.
Exactly. It's like a spillover effect.
Yeah.
One study published in Neuron, they showed that people who are used to living in cluttered environments, they actually had a harder time focusing even when they were in a clean, organized space.
Oh, wow.
It was like their brains got so used to that constant bombardment of look at me, that they struggled to adapt when it was calmer.
Oh, that's kind of scary. So even if I manage to declutter my space, my brain might still be wired for distraction.
It's definitely something to keep in mind. And then we get to the 4th impact.
Okay.
And this is the emotional toll.
Okay.
Clutter doesn't just mess with our thinking, it messes with our feelings too.
Oh, tell me about it. I know that feeling of stress and anxiety when I'm surrounded by a mess.
It's not just a feeling.
Right.
Studies have shown that clutter can trigger the release of cortisol. That's the stress hormone.
Oh, yeah?
And unfortunately, cortisol makes it even harder to focus.
Oh.
So it creates this vicious cycle where the stress of clutter actually makes it more difficult to deal with the clutter itself.
So it's like a double whammy.
Right.
The clutter stresses me out, and then the stress makes it even harder to actually declutter and get organized.
It's like a runaway train of stress and clutter.
Yeah.
And this is where that concept of location-specific adaptation comes in that you mentioned before. Like, our brains are pretty amazing. They're so adaptable, and they try to make up for that constant visual overload from clutter.
So our brains are trying to find a way to deal with the chaos.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The Yale study showed that different areas of the visual cortex, they actually become specialized in processing information from specific locations in our visual field. So even if certain areas are always cluttered, your brain tries to adapt by dedicating specific resources to process information from those areas.
So it's like my brain is saying, okay, I know there's always a mess over there on the desk.
Right.
I'm going to try to create a special zone to deal with it.
That's a really good way to think about it. It shows how incredible our brain's plasticity is, its ability to rewire itself based on our experiences. But here's the thing. Adaptation doesn't mean immunity.
Okay, so even if my brain is trying to compensate for the clutter,
yeah,
it doesn't mean it's not still affecting me on some level.
Exactly. It's like if you live near an airport, you might get used to the sound of planes taking off and landing all the time.
Right.
But that doesn't mean the noise isn't still impacting your sleep or your stress level.
That's a really helpful analogy. So even if I feel like I've mastered the art of living with clutter, my brain might still be paying a price behind the scenes.
That's a key takeaway here.
Yeah.
It's like this low-grade chronic stressor that we might not even be aware of. And this is actually where the difference between physical clutter and digital clutter becomes really important.
Right. I was just thinking about that. My messy desk versus a million tabs open on my computer. Are they really that different in terms of how they affect our brains?
That's a fantastic question, and it's one that researchers are really starting to look into more. While both types of clutter can mess with our brains, digital clutter, it kind of comes with its own set of challenges.
I think we're just about out of time for this segment, but I am dying to know more about this digital clutter dilemma.
Yeah.
We'll be right back after a short break to delve deeper into the world of digital distractions and how they impact our cognitive well-being. Don't go anywhere.
Definitely. Welcome back. So we were just starting to talk about digital clutter and
Right. Yeah, it's like physical clutter, but on steroids.
Yeah.
You've got flashing icons, endless notifications, and that constant pull of social media. Our devices are designed to distract us.
They absolutely are. Smartphones, computers, they're engineered to capture our attention with every ping, every buzz, every little notification. And this constant stream of stuff, it has a big impact on our brains.
So are you saying it's not just about willpower? The digital clutter itself is making it harder to focus?
Absolutely. Our devices are literally wired to hijack our attention. And unlike physical clutter, which we can at least try to ignore, our devices are always there. We're constantly being bombarded with information, making digital clutter a much tougher opponent.
Okay, this is giving me a whole new perspective on my organized chaos approach to life. But wait, are all brains equally susceptible to this digital onslaught? What about people with ADHD? Does digital clutter affect them differently?
That's a crucial question, and the answer is yes. Research suggests that people with ADHD are even more sensitive to visual clutter, both physical and digital. Their brains already have a harder time filtering out irrelevant information, so the constant stimulation from digital devices can be super overwhelming.
So for someone with ADHD, even a small amount of digital clutter can feel like sensory overload.
Absolutely. Imagine trying to focus on a conversation while someone's flashing a strobe light in your face.
Okay.
That's kind of what it's like for someone with ADHD trying to concentrate in a digitally cluttered environment.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. That's really insightful. But here's another thing I've been wondering about. Does everyone even see clutter the same way? I mean, what one person considers cluttered might be another person's creative workspace, right?
You've hit on another really interesting point. Our perceptions of clutter are definitely influenced by our individual preferences and cultural backgrounds. For example, research has shown that Eastern and Western cultures tend to process visual information differently, and this can affect how we respond to clutter.
So are you saying that someone from Japan, for instance, might perceive clutter differently than someone from the U.S.?
Exactly. Eastern cultures tend to process visual information more holistically, taking in the whole scene, while Western cultures often focus more on individual objects. So a room that might feel cluttered and overwhelming to someone from a Western culture might not be as distracting to someone from an Eastern culture.
That's fascinating. So clutter isn't just a matter of personal preference. It's also shaped by our cultural experiences. It's like this whole other layer of complexity we never even considered.
And we're only just beginning to understand the full extent of how our environment shapes our cognitive function.
Okay, so we've talked about the immediate impact of clutter on our focus, memory, and stress levels. But what about the long-term effects? Does living with clutter for years actually change our brains over time?
That's a question researchers are actively exploring, and some early evidence suggests that chronic exposure to clutter could lead to structural changes in the brain, particularly in areas related to stress regulation and memory.
Wait, are you telling me that clutter can actually rewire my brain?
It's not quite as dramatic as that, but there's some evidence to suggest that prolonged exposure to clutter, which keeps those cortisol levels elevated, can have a detrimental effect on certain brain regions. One study found that individuals living with high levels of clutter for 5 years or more showed a decrease in gray matter volume in the hippocampus, a brain area crucial for memory formation and recall.
Wow. So it's not just about feeling stressed in the moment, it's about the cumulative effect of that stress on my brain over time.
Exactly. And while more research is needed to fully understand the long-term consequences, it highlights the importance of creating and maintaining a healthy environment for our brains, both physically and digitally.
This deep dive is seriously making me rethink my relationship with clutter. It's much more than just a visual nuisance. It's about creating an environment that supports our cognitive health and allows our brains to function at their best.
I'm glad to hear you say that. Knowing how clutter affects us is the first step towards making positive changes.
Absolutely. So now that we understand the problem, let's talk solutions. What can we actually do about it? How do we declutter our lives and create environments that truly support our well-being?
Well, the good news is there are a lot of practical strategies we can implement, both in our physical spaces and in our digital lives. And it doesn't have to be overwhelming.
Okay, I'm ready to declare a truce with my clutter. Where do we start?
When it comes to tackling physical clutter, one of the simplest but most effective approaches is to just start small.
You mean I don't have to try to declutter my entire house in one weekend?
Exactly. Choose one area, like your desk drawer, a corner of your living room, or even just a shelf in your closet, and just focus on that.
That's a relief. I was starting to feel overwhelmed just thinking about it. One drawer at a time sounds much more manageable.
And once you've decluttered that small area, you'll likely feel a sense of accomplishment that will motivate you to keep going. It's like a domino effect for decluttering.
I like that. Small wins leading to bigger changes. What else can we do to kind of stay motivated and avoid getting overwhelmed?
Another really helpful tip is to be ruthless with yourself.
Ruthless. That sounds a bit
It's
intense.
about being honest about what you truly need and value. Ask yourself, do I really need this? For every item you encounter.
So we're back. And I don't know about you, but my brain is feeling a little less cluttered already. Just having this conversation is kind of therapeutic.
I know what you mean. Sometimes just talking about these things can help us gain clarity and see things from a fresh perspective.
You know, it's funny. The other day, I was trying to remember my grocery list while I was cleaning out a really cluttered drawer.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt like my brain just totally short-circuited. I stood there for like 5 minutes, just trying to remember what I needed to buy.
Oh, that's a perfect example of how clutter can tax our working memory. Your brain was trying to process all that visual information from the drawer while also trying to hold onto your grocery list,
Yeah.
and it just couldn't keep up.
It's almost as if clutter creates a kind of mental static,
Hmm,
you know? It makes it harder for thoughts to flow freely.
that's a great way to put it. And it really highlights why creating calm and organized environments is so important. It's not just about aesthetics, it's about giving our brains the space they need to function at their best.
I'm already feeling inspired to tackle some of the clutter hotspots in my own life. I'm going to start with my desk. Maybe I'll even try that minimalist desktop background you mentioned.
Those are great first steps. Remember, you don't have to do everything at once. Just start with one small area and go from there. You'll be amazed at how much of a difference it can make.
You know, as we've been talking, I've been thinking about how this whole conversation about clutter also applies to our digital lives.
Hmm.
We're constantly bombarded with information online, and it feels like it's getting harder and harder to focus.
Hmm.
Do you think the same principles we've been talking about also apply to our digital spaces?
Absolutely. In fact, some experts believe that digital clutter might be even more challenging to deal with than physical clutter because it's so pervasive and accessible. It's everywhere.
It's true. Our devices are always with us, and it's so easy to get sucked into that endless scroll of social media or the constant stream of notifications.
Exactly. And just like physical clutter can create that sense of overwhelm and distraction, digital clutter can have the same effect on our brains.
So what can we do about it? Are there any digital decluttering tips you can share?
Absolutely. Here are a few things you can try. Close any unnecessary tabs and windows. Unsubscribe from email lists you no longer read. Delete apps you haven't used in months. And turn off non-essential notifications.
Okay, those are all great practical tips. It's funny, just hearing you say those things makes me feel a little lighter, like I'm already decluttering my mental space.
That's the power of awareness. Once we understand how these things are affecting us, we can start to make conscious choices to create a more supportive environment for our brains.
So it's not about becoming a digital hermit or living in a sterile environment. It's about finding that balance and creating a space where we can thrive.
Beautifully said. It's about being intentional with our technology and our surroundings and making choices that support our cognitive well-being.
This has been such an insightful deep dive into the world of visual clutter. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It's been my pleasure. I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to take a look at their own spaces and see how they can make small changes to create a more mindful and clutter-free life.
I think that's a great note to end on. Remember, decluttering is a journey, not a destination. And even small steps can lead to big changes in how you feel and how your brain functions. Thanks for joining us today, and until next time, may your spaces be clear and your minds be at ease.